Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Janice Velasquez Farmer, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm currently serving as the Director for Intercultural Services at Whatcom Community College. I'm very, very excited that many of you are turned out to join us today. I did just mention that a couple of our panelists that were on that outreach and marketing that you may have seen have been pulled away for some urgent needs. And so they will be unable to join us, but we do have a great panel still ready to go. And we are happy about that. And let's see, I think that Marco has made his way in to this. If not, we will just continue waiting patiently for him. So to welcome you all today, Andy's here. So to welcome you all today, I want to begin. Normally, we will give a shout out to honor and acknowledge that we are on stolen land. And in order to do that today, what I'd really like to do is honor that this is a day that normally at Whatcom Community College, we would be hanging red dresses for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And to do the land acknowledgement today, I would like to share with you a video that one of our directors shared with our campus. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to do that, as long as technology works for me. Can you hear the sound? In Bellingham, we are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, including the Nooksack, the Lummi, the Semyamu, and the Samish. And I hope that you will take a moment to acknowledge the lands that you are on and spend the day remembering and acknowledging that there are many missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it is our hope that the work that we do will always bring attention and continue our abilities to repair and rebuild relationships. So thank you for spending that time with me to watch the video, which is very powerful, and also to spend some time on your own acknowledging the work that we do and the space that we hold today. So once again, my name is Janice Velasquez Farmer, and I am so excited to bring this program to you. I also have to honor that Tanya Zaragoza Rosas and Enrique Lopez are unable to join us today. Tanya is the one who pulled together this fantastic panel, and they've had an urgent need that has taken them away from the ability to participate, but they definitely send their love to all of you that join us today. And so now I just hope to get into this conversation that you've all been very patiently waiting for. So thank you for that. I'm going to allow our panelists to introduce themselves, and it is my hope that you will just be as motivated as I am by all of their experiences and the wisdom they bring to this conversation. And we'll begin with Vero.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see so many beautiful faces on here that I recognize both from campus and community-based work. So I feel like I'm in the company of family. So I'm honored. Thank you, Janice. Thank you to Tanya. I feel honored to be in the company of both Marco and Irene. I shared a little bit with Janice. I know, Irene, you're on here. A little bit of how we met through some back in the day in Pasadena and some organizing work there. And so it's been a minute, but it's so good to see you, and I'm honored to be on this panel with you, given your longstanding work around ethnic studies and the work you're doing for your students and your community. So I am currently associate professor and director of the Education and Social Justice minor at Western Washington University. In a nutshell, most of my work looks at understanding the racial inequities in education, the causes of those inequities, and how they primarily impact students of color, and in particular Latinx students. A little bit about my work currently. I'm in a moment of transition in my work as I sort of not reconcile, but address some of the tensions of being both university faculty, but also desiring something much more than the university provides in terms of really securing an education that all our communities deserve. So one of the things that I'm in the process of doing right now is transitioning from university leadership work and working to kind of re-engage my community-based work. And in that spirit, I'm currently working with Dr. Longoria, who is a colleague of mine in secondary education, along with local teachers and youth in Bellingham to begin a process of laying out ethnic studies for Bellingham schools. So that's my current work right now, and I'm hoping to actually be teaching ethnic studies at the high school come next year, and doing some of that work much more intentionally as I work to kind of navigate and transform what we can provide in the College of Education in Woodring for hopefully what will be ethnic studies educators of the future. So that is my current work, and so I'll stop there. But again, thank you both, and thank you, Janice, for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Marco, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to have us on this afternoon. I feel very humbled to be able to be on this panel with both Vero and Irene, who I've known for a while. I was one of Vero's students, so it's really nice to be able to be on this panel with Vero. And I've known Irene for maybe 10 years, maybe more actually. I think at least 10 years. I've known Irene for a very long time. We used to dance in the same ethnic dance group, and a group that we had started in Seattle. I want to say about a decade ago. So I've also known Irene for a very long time. I'm very happy to be on here. Some of the work that I've been currently working on has been more in line with local politics. I think it's important to get Latinos particularly elected to local office. So that's one of the things that I've been focusing a lot of my energy lately. A lot of my background comes from taking part in our annual farm worker marches here in the Skagit Valley, and then also doing student organizing when I was a student, both at Wacom and at Western. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm very excited to to take part in this conversation, and I want to thank Wacom community. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you also for bringing us Irene. And I'm so glad that you both said her name before I did, because I would have messed that up big time. So I'm really excited to meet you, and I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself. Would you like to introduce yourself to this whole beautiful group?
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Hi, everyone. My name is Irene Sanchez. You didn't mess it up. Sometimes people call me Irene, but I prefer Irene. So I'm really honored that Marco contacted me shortly ago. Washington and basically all that area, even Skagit, I used to drive up there to dance when we didn't have a danza group in Seattle. So I got to know, Skagit Valley, and went up to Bellingham. I was living in Seattle for 7 years while I did my master's and my PhD at the University of Washington. I'm a proud community college transfer student. That was what a lot of my research focused on. But when I returned to California, when I returned home, I'm a mother. And so, I was trying to find the good fit. And just because, someone goes to grad school, it doesn't necessarily mean like, they become a professor. So I am actually a high school Chicano Latino studies teacher. I teach at 3 different high schools when I used to go physically. Every day I would go travel between the 3 high schools in Azusa Unified School District. I'm speaking to you here from Boyle Heights, Los Angeles. All this area from LA to the San Gabriel Valley is occupied Tongva land. And so I always want to recognize that. And, a lot of my work is grounded in my community with the students I teach, back home with my community in the Inland Empire, which is about 60 miles east of Los Angeles too. So that's where you usually find me. And on the internet, I write. So I'm a freelance writer, and I have my own blog called Chicana PhD. And that's how I spend my time besides mothering my 7-year-old son.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you as well. And thank you all again for being here. And to get us started, it'd be really difficult for us to start a conversation about Cinco de Mayo without thinking also about what is happening. I mean, based on social media today alone, one of the memes that popped up for me was, what are the chances of Cinco de Mayo falling on a Taco Tuesday? And in my mind, I'm like, oh, how do you engage with this narrative, and what does it mean for us? So I'm wondering if, Vero, you could start by giving us an overall snapshot of the true history behind the 5th of May.
Sure. And I'm looking at both Irene and Marco here. Feel free to jump in, and we'll make this much more organic in the process of having a conversation. But just to give a little bit of context, Cinco de Mayo, which actually isn't widely celebrated in Mexico, shocker, right? Although I would say that in Puebla, which is, it commemorates a particular battle in Puebla, Poblanos do celebrate it a little bit differently. So I do want to acknowledge that even though it's not widely celebrated, Puebla has a particular public memory of the event that I think we need to acknowledge. Often it's confused for Mexican Independence Day, which actually occurs 50 years prior to the Battle of Puebla, which Cinco de Mayo commemorates. So the Battle of Puebla occurs on May 5th, 1862, whereas the actual Mexican Independence Day was September 16th, 1810. So I wanted to be clear that these two things often get conflated, but are not the same thing. What's important here to remember, and I want to sort of be brief here, but what's important here to remember is that part of the reason why it's not widely celebrated in Mexico is that the battle was a battle that resulted, so Benito Juarez was the president of Mexico in 1861, and it was at a time when Mexico was undergoing some financial ruin. And so it was unable to pay back some of the debt it owed to Britain, to France, and to Spain. He was able to negotiate with Britain and Spain, but not necessarily with France. Napoleon decides that he wants to take advantage of this to expand his empire, and lo and behold, sends troops to Mexico. Benito Juarez assembles what is a primarily indigenous Mexicano army to defeat the French army. Long story short, they won. It was one of these underdog victories that they weren't expected to win. But France ends up staying much longer than the battle we would have hoped to have won. And so part of the reason it's not commemorated in the same way is because it was a short-lived victory. What we also understand in the context of what happened in terms of the Battle of Puebla is that this was also happening during in the US historical moment was happening during the civil rights, not civil rights, sorry, the Civil War. And so in that moment, there was also, which I'll talk about later, that is a really important historical moment, largely because it later begins to, largely contributes to the reason so many Latinos, the Latinx community in the US begins to energize around this particular battle, largely because it was a moment in which, in terms of the Civil War, fighting against slavery, Latinos were also trying to think about, what was their role in the context of the US state. And so, it was a commitment to sort of think through what liberation looked like, the possibilities for Latinos in the US. And so again, the Civil War happening at the same time is an important note to make around the Battle of Puebla and what comes to be celebrated as Cinco de Mayo in the context of the US. So that gives a little bit of a snapshot. One of the things that I also want to be clear about this is that, that as we sort of think about Cinco de Mayo, and I want to be clear, I think part of what we'll get into is obviously the critique and the way that it's been taken up under a capitalist economy, the commercialization, the way that Mexicans become caricatures. We'll definitely talk about that, but I also want to acknowledge that Cinco de Mayo, and here I'm drawing particularly from the work of David Hayes Bautista. He's a professor at UCLA who writes about this in a book called Cinco de Mayo, an American Tradition. And he specifically talks about the importance of public memory around the event. Because for many Latinos, Cinco de Mayo, initially and over time, the skeleton of Cinco de Mayo leaves, but it was kind of a David versus Goliath story, right? It was the underdogs beating out the French. It was a moment that I think becomes celebrated as Mexicanos in particular continue to deal with marginalization on multiple fronts from state-sanctioned violence. So in that context, I think what's important is to think through like that Cinco de Mayo, if we can recover the public memory, becomes actually an important conversation to be had around why it matters so much, particularly for Latinos in the US, even as we're critiquing its commercialization, the caricatures that have arisen through these master narratives, and we can go into more of that. But that gives you a bit of a snapshot. And if Marco and Irene, if you want to add anything, that's sort of my quick and very quick summary of a much bigger event that probably merits a much longer conversation, but wanted to just give some context.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, echoing a lot of what Veronica already said, a lot of the information that is out there, thankfully, David Hayes Bautista has had a far reach. I've been concerned about Cinco de Mayo, I think in different ways now because of teaching the past 3 years and starting a program that's pretty fresh. So how do you teach about the truth, right? I mean, all this time that students are in school, most of the time we just assume sometimes like, oh, maybe they learned this, maybe they didn't. And a lot of times they don't know. And of course, they're not even taught our own history in public schools. And so a lot of times in my classes, we'll get into these discussions about what something means. And most of my students know Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day, but those who don't, we have to break it down and we have to discuss with them, right? And so I'll pull from things like David Hayes Bautista. I pull from things like Occupied America, 500 years of Chicano history. And to teach them the truth, because that's what ethnic studies is, and it is U.S. history. And Cinco de Mayo kind of enters this point where it's like, okay, it's celebrated in the U.S. and people know about it, so it kind of just gets enveloped in. So that discussion about what Cinco de Mayo is or isn't has to come up, because in the context of thinking about capitalism and how things get commercialized and kind of become this costume, right, for other people to try on as they see appropriate, which it's not. But we talk about those things so that not only do I help my students and we can discuss and they can come to their own understanding about what this day means, but they can also tell other people as they go forward, that they know, the truth, that this is the truth about Cinco de Mayo. Here's the facts about it. And, this is why cultural appropriation or different things isn't right. And so those are all excellent, excellent conversations to start having with students, whether they're in high school. I think ethnic studies should be started in middle schools, to be honest, to kind of give them that base, right? That history that we often aren't told. David Hayes Bautista's work always spoke to me, because when you see him speak, he's very engaging, and he's very, I remember he had a really long PowerPoint about it when I've seen him speak on it. And so his work has been really solid in making sure people know the truth about Cinco de Mayo and what it means, and how we can kind of push back against these lies we're basically surrounded by in schools, in society.
You both brought up capitalism, and I'm curious about your thoughts. Marco, maybe you can start us off on how does American culture, how do we benefit from this idea that we've developed around Cinco de Mayo?
Well, I think one of the things for us to consider is that in a culture like that we live in a culture that we live here in the U.S. And in a system that that's based on capitalism, we're always going to find ways as a culture to be able to turn things into commodities, and so Cinco de Mayo really becomes another commodity, or another way to make money. I think what Vero and Irene were mentioning earlier, kind of really resonated with me. And I kind of want to go back a little bit and talk about sort of putting this into context, right? It's sort of like the reason that Cinco de Mayo emerged as a holiday in the United States, given that we've been discussing that it wasn't it's not really a holiday for the most part in Mexico. And so I wanted to kind of provide some context of the time period where the holiday emerged. And so when the holiday emerged as the first celebration of Cinco de Mayo, it was actually just a couple weeks after the Battle of Puebla. So that's the very first time it was celebrated, when newspapers had informed people of Mexican descent in California that this battle had taken place down in Puebla. So that's when you see the very first celebration of Cinco de Mayo, as early as the 1860s. And so, to kind of provide more context, part of the reason that this was important to folks that weren't living in Mexico, that were now basically living in California in a new country, was because we have to remember that this is only a little bit over a decade after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? So to provide some context, the treaty had stipulated particular agreements between the United States and Mexico, and what would become basically new citizens of the United States under this treaty, when the Mexicans that lived on this side of what would become the border, this treaty stipulated what sort of citizenship they would have once they joined the United States. And so folks quickly began to realize, Mexicans and other folks from other regions of Latin America that were traveling across the Pacific, what they came to quickly realize was that the rights that they were promised under that particular treaty were rights that were not respected, right? And so what you quickly see after 1848 is that that California starts enacting what they call the Greaser Act of 1855, which basically punishes anybody of so-called Indian and Spanish race who were not of good character. And so so what happens is that it gives law enforcement free reign to be able to arrest anybody who they perceived of being of Indian and Spanish heritage. And so so Cinco de Mayo, in some ways, I think for people that were living in California during this time period, they perceive, and I think Vero kind of was alluding to this earlier, they see this as sort of connected to what's going on in the Civil War, because what happens is that they start to realize that the invasion of Mexico and the revolt of the Confederate States, it's somehow related to one another. And if they hope to maintain or keep the rights that were promised to them under the treaty, that it's to their advantage that the Confederacy loses, and that the French are expelled from Mexico. And so we have a holiday that that was really started as a sort of a celebration of a battle that has now become just another way to be able to make money. And so and under a current system of capitalism, anything that is profitable is turning into this commodity. But I think what's most interesting though is that even though this celebration has been celebrated in the U.S. for we could say almost 150 years, since the 1860s, it hadn't really become a very big holiday by the mainstream up until I would say maybe the 80s or the 90s. And so over 130 years later, as our numbers became larger across the country, and there was a sort of a way for the system to make money off of it. But those are some of the things that I wanted to add, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other folks' takes on it are as well.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who are listening in, please feel free to add questions into the chat box, and I'll try to keep my eye on that. I'm interested, Irene, you brought up appropriation, and I'm wondering if you can speak about appropriation versus appreciation, or how that shows up in celebrations around Cinco de Mayo.
I teach in schools that are majority Latinx students, like 92%. I always talk, when we talk about this history, it's amazing when we talk about Mexican schools, how we think it's like a thing of the past, but schools are still segregated today. And my students see it, right? And we can discuss like the how it has been commodified, and the ways in which, beer companies and just different types of establishments kind of make it a joke in some ways, like almost to the point where it's, we become a joke and the history is erased. And so I'm always for accuracy. And something Marco said, even though it's kind of not answering the question, but he brought up something as I was writing, and I just wanted to add this because I think it's important for the context of that time period when this happened, especially when you talk about California. This is something I've taken on as a side project with my students, because this whole area used to be, more the San Gabriel Valley and the Inland Empire, Southern California. It's a citrus empire. That's why the IE is called the Inland Empire, is because it used to be the center of citrus production. And during this time period, post 1848, there was a big move to push, like this fake history. Kerry McWilliams, in his book, North from Mexico, called it fantasy heritage. So a lot of my personal research work around teaching and digital archives has come from researching about fantasy heritage and what that looks like. In Riverside, where I mostly grew up after we moved from East LA, you see remnants of that everywhere when you see the Spanish, right? Kind of more uplifted than the indigenous. And in terms of this history that was going on at the time. And so the goal of fantasy heritage was to erase that and kind of make it a fun thing, right? Whether they were trying to commodify it or not back then, maybe not so much until later with these campaigns and these advertisements, but definitely there was a violent erasure of history, our history, going on at that time. And fantasy heritage is something that comes to mind because, it is a made up, it's make believe, but people have kind of accepted that, because you see it in the architecture, you see it in what kind of places here, especially in the Southwest, get landmarks put on them as an important place. I mean, we're sitting on battlegrounds here from that time period, right? But we wouldn't even know where they're at because they've been covered up. And so I feel like, that all plays a role into how Cinco de Mayo also came about, because they were really pushing in California, the Southwest, and this whole idea of fiestas and Spanish parties and all this kind of stuff, and a particular type of dress and food. And oftentimes in some of these places in Southern California, they actually didn't even invite Mexicans. They would have white people dress up like in these costumes. So this kind of stuff has been going on since that time period. And thanks, Marco, for and Veronica, when you put that all together, it just it reminded me of that.
And if I could add, I mean, I think Irene brings up a really important point too about, and I think it gets at some of what you're also asking, Janice, about the difference between appropriation and appreciation. I think to engage this work, to think if you say you claim to be engaged in the work of justice, you also have to be very much invested in becoming a historian. And I mean that not in terms of what school necessarily, but I'm talking about investing in community and looking at sort of our local historians, community-based historians, really paying attention to developing an analysis, because what happens, I think, and this is true, I mean, Cinco de Mayo is a prime example of this, that we have done a disservice to engage these moments and these analysis through an ahistorical lens. And so we end up doing what I often tell my students, we do a lot of foods, festivals, and foolishness that I think comes with, quote unquote, celebrating multiculturalism. That is ahistorical and not grounded in really understanding how this came about. And I think to Irene's point, like when you start to uncover that history, you start to realize how appropriation is prime, central. And that also can't be disconnected from class politics. So let's be clear that capitalism plays a big part because it requires a certain commodification, a certain consumption, a particular standpoints to profit off of them. So in that regard, I think it behooves, even before we begin to understand what this looks like, we have to invest in understanding the historical underpinnings. Then it kind of points out, and that Marco also stresses, that I think is critical if we claim a position of justice. I think that's a vital thing to take on. And I think, I'm really suspect right now of like anything with diversity, equity, and justice in its title. I really don't know people's underlying theories of change. So I think before we get into questions of appreciation, I think we really need to unpack how these positions have taken shape through particular logics that make us believe terms of equity and appreciation are for our benefit, and actually just another facade or another logic that are harming community. And in this particular instance, looking at Latino communities specifically, but I would argue that would be my entry point into the appropriation appreciation conversation.
I think that I hear a lot about when I hear arguments from anybody who feels the need to argue about appropriation, it's just fun. We're just having fun. And when I hear that, I go right back to the title of this, and which is, based off the title of another conversation, but the danger of whitewashing the culture, the danger of whitewashing what Cinco de Mayo actually means. So what is the result? How do you think that this results in teaching, our children and teaching everyone else around us when we want to have these conversations? So I'm curious about stereotypes and how you've experienced stereotypes associated or somehow connected to this idea of whitewashing Cinco de Mayo. And that will go to all three of you.
Well, I'll start here, and then I think both Marco and Irene, I know that they both, I know with Marco, we had several conversations in our classes on campus and in our conversations as well. And I'm also thinking about your work, Irene, around ethnic studies that I will position here as, in many ways, the antidote or the answer to how do we build a more critical analysis of this work. But I would say, like, I want to sort of step outside of my academic role in a second and talk about what it's meant for me as a tia, as an aunt to my 5-year-old nephew, who will come across these narratives, right? And oftentimes will come to me and he calls me Nina because I'm his godmother, but he'll say things to me like, Nina, is that who we are, right? Is this who we are, this caricature, right? And he knows this because we oftentimes tell him, like, we talk to him a lot about, where he's from, and even though he was born in the US, culturally, really trying to instill a certain lens that he comes to appreciate his family and himself in a very particular way. But I'm constantly navigating. So when people say it's just, they mean no harm. Tell that to a 5-year-old who begins to see himself through a lens that is telling him that he's a caricature, or that he's a clown, or that he's a cartoon, or that there's a story literally out there, a children's book that talks about Mexican the bandits, right? I mean, these are the kinds of ways that young people begin to internalize who they are in the world. And so when I think about answering that question, I think about my 5-year-old nephew, and I think about the ways in which it is our responsibility to speak, to disrupt those narratives, but also to think about how do we instill a more critical analysis that he's able to, because I can't be with him at every moment that these sort of messages and stereotypes come across him, or that he's impacted by them, that he's able to analyze through them and really build a more, that he relies on a particular cultural awareness of who he is, that is not relying on the majoritarian story of who he is. So that's how I would respond to that question on a more personal level, is I see it through him, who's constantly asking me, Nina, is this who we are? And having to debunk or just, challenge those narratives, I think is, to me, a form of violence. And also what is our responsibility as educators beyond that of, what we do in the academy.
I'm just gonna jump in and just kind of talk about how, at least for me, it's interesting because I've never celebrated Cinco de Mayo in my entire life, which is kind of interesting in some ways, right? I've never really thought of Cinco de Mayo as any sort of holiday since I was a kid, or even now as an adult. There weren't any days where I was particularly looking forward to to be able to, I don't know, to go and go to have Mexican food or drink or whatever, right? It wasn't something that to me seemed like something that I was going to celebrate. I usually would have a celebration on Cinco de Mayo because it happens to be my sister's birthday. So happy birthday to her! I think she's on here now. But that was the reason that I celebrated Cinco de Mayo. It wasn't for any other particular reason other than it was my sister's birthday. But I think over time, one of the things that I noticed as I was growing up, from being a young man and being a teenager, was sort of the media portrayals that we see in mainstream culture about who we are, and sort of the narratives that are promoted as giving us a sort of identity, right? I think and not just being a caricature in Cinco de Mayo, or being a guy with a sombrero sitting on a donkey with a sarape, or what have you. I think those are some of the narratives, but there are also other narratives that are also created in popular culture, like movies, right? And narratives that we see in other movies that are not just the stereotypical drunk Mexican with a sombrero and a donkey, right? I think about sort of the movies or sort of the movies that we see on Netflix or on other mediums that portray us in particular ways, whether that be and I watch them, all movies, or like series like Narcos, that have a particular image of what we're supposed to be, right? And so I think when you're really young, those sort of images become very dangerous, because you tend to believe that that's the only person you could ever be. I remember, I remember being a kid and watching American Me for the first time. I don't know if folks have watched that movie, and I wanted to be the guy in jail. I was like, oh, I want to be that guy, because he seemed like a tough guy that I wanted to be like him, right? And so in my at the time when I was in school, when I was in middle school, at the time we used to have little rooms where kids would be put in these little rooms that were like cells. There was the size of a cell, and you get put in the room if you acted out, got in a fight, or you weren't doing what you were supposed to. And I liked being in that room because I thought I was like the guy from the movie, right? The guy that was in the movie that he was in jail, and I was maybe 11 years old at the time, right? But I associated myself, and I looked up upon myself like within that particular like prism of what me as a young Mexican male needed to be, right? And so I think a lot of these stereotypes that tell the story of who we are harmful because they don't give us room to be able to flourish to the individuals that we can become, right? They only give us a certain amount of characters that we're able to play and aspire to be, but we're not given the opportunity to be that and maybe a million other things, right? To be able to be who you want to be and aspire to be any individual that that the rest of society can be, right? And kind of going back, not taking too much time. The sad thing about it is that, me not celebrating Cinco de Mayo, like you could say many of our ancestors did, 150 years ago when it was the first battle. I think it goes to show that even things that we create over time are taken from us, and they don't even become, and they're no longer ours, right? And that's why we no longer celebrate them, because even though we created them, we feel like they no longer belong to us. And so I think that's sort of the power of appreciation and of taking, right? It's as another form of colonization, to be able to take not only individuals as people or as land, but also as culture, and to take it for other people's consumption. And so that's just a little bit of me kind of thinking through this stuff, and everybody kind of having their take.
I'd love for one of you to expand on that, Marco, because I think that idea of colonization of culture, we think of colonization as very much a physical taking of land, right? And that makes it so much easier for us to take these messages or take these celebrations and make them our own. Can you all speak to just the idea of colonization and what it means to have culture taken, to have messages taken, to have them changed and fed back to us and our children, and for generations this has been happening. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I can jump in unless someone else. I'm gonna give some space to either Irene or Marco if they want to jump in.
I will try to unmute my microphone. Can you guys hear me? Can y'all hear me?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So the thing, and I try to incorporate the question that was just asked, and I was listening to Marco and Veronica speak about stereotypes, right? It is a violent erasure. It is these roles they give us to play, right? If they take our celebration and they make it something else, they also take our history. And that's the goal. And that is directly tied to colonization, because that is the way they have taken, right? And they continue to take. One quote that my students know at the beginning of the year when we do our unit on identity, which is what we start off with, is no history, no self, right? N-O, history, no self. No history, no self, right? So we have to know this history, and we have to know how it's been attempted to be violently erased and how we're still here surviving despite all of that. And they do give us roles to play. In my research that I was doing on fantasy heritage, you could easily go to see how we're depicted in Westerns, how we're depicted in just caricatures, the bandits, and things like that. We could read it in books. But what I had started doing was listening to corridos, because that is where a lot of these stories were passed down. And so having my students listen to those and listen to what really happened in this time period that we're discussing, that Cinco de Mayo did come out of post 1848 in the Civil War, having to do with, the invasion of Texas to begin with, we're also looking at the violence that occurred, right? So while they're trying to push this idea of fantasy heritage in US history, and how, it's just a big fiesta and we're celebrating you. They say they're celebrating you. No, they're not celebrating you. They're trying to cover up the fact that they lynched so many Mexicans during that time period. And it was all over the Southwest. And oftentimes people don't learn about that until maybe you're lucky to go to college, right? You don't learn about those things. And so you start to believe those stereotypes. I'm a poet too. So there's a poem I wrote, like, if someone tells you you're inferior long enough, you begin to believe it. And I see that with my students. I see that when my son comes home telling me things like stuff he's heard on the playground post the election of, the man in office right now. Yeah, it's all an attempt to erase not just what happened, but to slowly chip away at who we are and dehumanize us and to take away our humanity. And they do that by trying to erase that history, by trying to make us these, box us into these roles that we need to play in society, because who does that serve in the end? It serves the people who own the means of production. It serves in the school system for them to say, hey, because you're from this background, you're going to end up working this kind of job. You're not going to go to college, because that's still happening too. So I see it as all being directly connected, that erasure of history to colonization, and then also to stereotypes. When you look at it in the present day, they're still serving to erase who we are. And I think that's why it's so much more important to make sure we get to these younger people sooner, right? Because I think when they start learning the truth about not just our history or about themselves, they start to feel more proud of themselves, and they start to believe that they can do things that they didn't think they could do, when most of the time the reason why they don't think they could do it is because, society's pushing down on them, and everything else around them is telling them they can't. And so that's why it's ever more urgent and important, especially in these times that we're living, that people know history and know the truth about who we are and what happened.
Thank you so much. Vero, I know you have more to add to that, and I'm wondering if I can tap into that just a little bit. As you add to the idea of the violent erasure and of colonization, can you also talk to us about whether it is possible to respectfully celebrate something like Cinco de Mayo?
To add to Irene's point, the first thing I'll say that as we think about what's required to disrupt, because let me be clear. Let me be clear that colonization has not ended. So as we continue to think about, because we oftentimes get taught in schools that colonization, or more specifically settler colonialism, which is when settlers come and stay and kind of re-engage or remake the institutions so that their ideologies become the what's valued and perpetuated in society. That it hasn't ended, and that project continues through many institutions, but largely through our schools. And so as we think about what, colonization and its contemporary manifestation, let me be clear that we are still in the continuation of the settler colonial state, and so settler colonial project. So one of the things for me that's really important in articulating that is to say that we can't also disconnect the notion of cultural colonization, or the ways in which our cultures are taken, commodified, appropriated, and disconnected from land and the taking of land. Those two things for me are intimate projects. So this is why we will always go back to, and again, it speaks so powerfully in the way that Cinco de Mayo has been misunderstood and appropriated, because it always comes back to these kind of the need to sell you a product. So that is always tied to capitalist logic, right? The need to sell you something, commodify, profit off of it. And to me, it always goes back to land. So one way that, sort of early on, sort of the taking of land had to engage other kinds of forces or technologies to ensure that would happen. So part of it is to Irene and Marco's point, is having the community who in many ways, this is indigenous communities, Latinx communities, again, whoever was on there, to really to have them believe that they were culturally inferior. So you begin this process of really, engaging the sort of a cultural colonization, because it was really in an effort to take over land and to take over those resources. So I want to be really clear that those two things for me are intimate projects. This is why I think I look to our indigenous and native scholars that help us make sense of some of this, because they're saying you cannot talk about colonization separate from the taking of land. So I want to make that also really clear in this. But to the point of can we respectfully acknowledge? I'm a person that I'm not, I think what oftentimes happens in some of this, we want to discard particular things. So, I've seen it really easy. People want to discard Cinco de Mayo and say, no, look, it's become a mockery of what it should be, right? And so I want nothing to do with it. Sort of, I won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And I am of the belief that I think if we engage this, like it's part of our history, and it's part of, I think we need to recover the public memory of what it really is, and to kind of engage sort of truth telling to its rightful context. And I think to do that, I think requires, and this is when I'll to Irene's point, I think there's nothing more radical, I think, in this work than to become an educator, than to become a teacher. Because I think that process of you embed that and begin to think about, especially at the youngest of ages, to engage people to have a more critical analysis of who they are and their histories, then there is going to be what we hope, right? As someone who embodies that. And again, I'm a little biased because I'm in that business of education and preparing educators, but I think that you do that, there's an exponential effect that these young people will go out and hopefully begin to engage a discourse or challenge this dominant discourse around how Cinco de Mayo has been taken. But when we discard those histories, we also discard, I think, what it's meant for so many of us in our communities, which I think what Marco points out, this was the David and Goliath story. It was the moment where we weren't marginal. And I think that this is something that for us, it is sort of a triumph. And I think I want to be careful here because it's a complicated story, but I nonetheless think that it's really important that we don't, as sort of, mainstream society commodifies this date, that we can recover it and bring it and shed light on it on our terms and give it its rightful place. So I think that it requires, educators, community folks, historians to come together and really think about it. And I think, quite frankly, right now, in a moment where you're seeing so much inequity, so much injustice, having a kind of a more grounded and critical history that informs what we do and who we are is more important now than ever. And so I go back to that point. Like, I think that, I'm in the work of hoping, aspiring to be a critical educator and hopefully inspiring others to become critical educators. But I think that to me is a really important project as we understand its historical legacy, the continued project of, colonization today, and also about recovering events in ways that do justice to what they're intended, to mean for us as a community, but also their rightful place in history. And I think that's important to this work. And I'll stop there.
I kind of wanted to talk. I'm thinking, one of the things that I think is important, and maybe an appropriate way to celebrate it is to understand how it was originally meant to be celebrated when it was, right? Because I think a lot of the celebration was really grassroots from different groups of people in little towns and cities across California that took this battle in Mexico and decided that they wanted to celebrate it, right? And when you look at the historical record, the way that Cinco de Mayo originally was celebrated was mostly a gathering of people that where they would gather and people would have speeches and they would talk about sort of what was affecting the community. There would be music. There would be fireworks. But it was more of I think in retrospect, one thing that we can kind of pick out of some of the ways those events were described. In some ways, they really were events to organize the community, and so in many ways, it was a sort of I don't want to say an excuse to organize the community, but it was an opportunity to use something where folks could be that folks could be used in where folks could use this opportunity. So I'm reading the messages where folks could be take this opportunity to be able to create something where they could build community. And so I think and going back to what we were talking about earlier, where you have where you have an event in the context of being sort of citizens in a new country where you basically had been there for a couple centuries, right? I think at some point for us to realize that most of the folks that that later became Mexicans were indigenous people that were indigenous to California, different tribal peoples that were indigenous to California, and indigenous people that had left Mexico City basically with Spanish troops in the 1550s, right? So we're talking about people that have been living there for in some cases thousands of years, and others that have been living there for centuries, right? And then all of a sudden, you have immigrants that are coming in from the East Coast that are sort of the newcomers, telling you what to do in a land that you've been living on for, thousands of years or centuries, right? And so I think, that's is there really a way to celebrate it? I mean, I think that's appropriate. I think, given the information, I think individuals will sort of make their own judgment as to how they think the best way to sort of acknowledge the celebration. Over the last couple of days, I've also thought about sort of what it means to celebrate Cinco de Mayo today, given the situation with COVID-19, right? Because I think I know that small businesses like Mexican restaurants, I think they're also counting on Cinco de Mayo to be celebrated, right? And then for them, it's also an opportunity to be able to make money when they're currently not able to make money, right? So I think I'm going to be the last person to tell you, don't go to a Mexican restaurant to go eat, right? Because I think a lot of those folks, that are community members, there are counting on being able to make money today, right? So I think it's a hard contradiction, right? Like, do you go and buy Mexican food or not? But a lot of folks, that's sort of that's the way that they make their living, right? And knowing that so much of the backbone of our local economies are predicated on those small businesses, particularly here in the Skagit Valley, where you have a lot of these restaurants that that are really the backbone of our economy. I think I'm going to be the last person to say, oh, don't go get tacos. I'm not going to be that person that says that, because I think sometimes I think we are very critical, but a lot of folks they're counting on being able to stay afloat with days like this, especially during a pandemic.
Marco, can I stay on you for just a moment? Because, we've talked a lot about how the origin of the day is about community. And I'm thinking about your profession and your experience in politics. How will you engage your community in a conversation or education about Cinco de Mayo?
Well, I think it's a really important conversation to have, right? Because I think it's a conversation that's never had, and without having a conversation in community, and I think this has been a really good opportunity to do that. And so thank you for the invitation. I think most folks don't realize sort of what if there's any harm in Cinco de Mayo, right? I think that's a lot of the problem is that people are not informed on the history. And I think those of us that that are informed, I think it is our responsibility to be able to let other folks know, right? Because I want to make the claim that education many times is denied to us, right? I have been really thinking about that over the last several weeks, even before the invitation to this panel, that unless you have a particular sort of education, you don't get to know, right? You sort of don't get to know you don't get to know your history because you're denied that history. And so I've sort of been lucky where I've been able to originally done it. I did it on my own before. I went to college when I was 23 years old, and so. But from when I was 17 or 18 years old till I was 23, it was history that I was reading on my own, prior to going to college. But then being in college was a way that I was able to kind of further explore it. But folks that are they don't have access to books, don't have access to don't have access to education in whatever form that might be, are sometimes denied that history. And I also want to make it clear that that people that are that Mexicans particularly that are also coming from this background, we shouldn't expect that every Mexican knows the history about Cinco de Mayo, because that's not the case, right? And so and to assume that everybody does, because those folks especially have also been denied that history, right? And so to think that because somebody is from a particular from a particular background that they know, you know, is not true. So those are just kind of some of my thoughts.
Thank you. Eden, I have the same question for you, but hopefully touching on your experience and your professional work as a writer and as a poet. How will you use that work to engage your community?
So I use a lot of history when I write poetry, the same stuff I'd probably teach in class. When I was thinking about, you know, like how do you go on knowing this, right? When Marco brought up the fact that it didn't become popular here in the US until the 60s, 70s, the 80s, that time period, we have to remember that that was the time of the Chicano Civil Rights Movement. It was a time of fighting for equal education. It was a time of the UFW rising, farm workers' rights that we still need today. Equal education for all, the blowouts. My dear mentor just passed away on Friday, Bobby Lee Verdugo, one of the walkout leaders of 1968 walkouts. You know, I think about all that. And so when Marco said, you know, they used it, you know, maybe to give speeches and things like that. I think anytime you can recognize, you know, our history and our culture in a respectful way, like I think it should be done. My earliest memory of Cinco de Mayo in my life was actually my mom. My mom, for the longest time, I call her a teacher back then, but she was a bilingual aide for many, many, many years. And bilingual aides are classified workers. You know, they help translate things, and you know, she would bring students in to, you know, break out from the room to help them understand materials better. And I used to go help her at her work sometimes at the elementary school she used to work at. And you know, my mom is a really good seamstress, and I didn't even know she knew Folklorico, really. Both my parents grew up, born and raised in East LA, and it was so interesting that, you know, she gathered the parents. It was a way for her to talk to the parents and to, you know, here's this dance I taught, you know, these kids, because they're not getting it anywhere else in the school. So my mom, you know, infused that, right? And I think anytime you can, it's a good thing. And I know it did have an impact on a lot of the parents and the students that my mother has worked with, because I think it's evident in the ways that people still recognize and respect her in that community. My mom actually just got her master's degree. She became a teacher when she was in her mid-50s. So my mom's actually a dual immersion 6th grade elementary school teacher. So that was my first memory when I was a kid of that, you know, celebration of that event. And my mom actually has an old painted like Mexican circle skirt with, you know, it looks like the Mexican flag. And she talked to them about the history and to the parents. And I think it was as an entrance point to engage them into talking about, you know, conditions in the schools and things like that. And so maybe sometimes we get away from that, but I look at events like Chicano Moratorium that happened after that, right? And times where we gather, I think if it can be done in a way that it is respectful, I think preserving the culture is political, though. I think recognizing our history is political, because for so long, you know, it's been denied or erased. And so when we can celebrate it, I think it's important. So the way that comes out in my teaching and my poetry and my writing is I just want people to know the truth about what happened. And I want my students to feel proud. I want them to hold their heads high. I want them, you know, when I get them at the beginning of the year, most of the time you ask them who's going to go to college and you don't get hardly any hands, right? When I ask them at the end of the year, right? And I work at all 3 high schools. I work at a continuation high school too. You know, these are kids who have been getting pushed out and messed with by the system for a very long time. And so, you know, to hear right before the pandemic, one of my students that I've had the whole year at the continuation school, he tells me, you know, when we did a reintroduction, because there was some new students that had kind of filtered in there. And, you know, I said, okay, everyone has to introduce yourself and say your name and what you want to do after high school. And he said, you know, at first he didn't know, right? He didn't want to go to college. And then by the end, right there in February, he was saying he wants to go to college and he wants to study history, right? And so, I mean, that's what it is. It's inspiring them and making them feel good about who they are and their history. And even if they're not a student who maybe can relate to Chicanx, Latinx history, because I do have students who, only a few though, because like I said, the schools are 92%, make them feel good about who they are and where they're coming from, even if they're not directly tied to that history. So You know, I just try to infuse it in everything I do and educate the students to know the truth about who we are, and that they have the capacity to create change right now, and, you know, educate others. They have that power.
Thank you so much. I have just one last question I'm going to ask you, Vero, and then I'll open it up to see if anyone else has questions. You've already all touched on this quite a bit, but I'd love for you to just spell it out for us. What really is the danger of whitewashing Cinco de Mayo?
So, I mean, I think so I think we've kind of already covered quite a few points here, and that we've stressed, you know, a bit about, you know, the dangers, particularly to this generation of especially, I'm looking particularly at young Latinos coming through the school system, and in a context in which schooling has become so much more standardized. The state determines what young people need to know, and I think they're developing analyses that aren't grounded in their own histories. And I think that I'm concerned, right, as high stakes testing, standardization in schools takes hold, and young people are led to believe there's only one version of history, usually the one that's taught by the state. And so as I think about the danger of whitewashing it, I think about that more and more young people are not provided, unless they encounter particular spaces or have folks in their families who, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily relegated to just college educated folks. So I want to debunk that myth too. This is thinking about our local historians or community folks that can help provide young people with critical analyses. They begin to believe these things about themselves, as we've shared earlier. So the danger of whitewashing it is that we go further and further away from, quite frankly, the truth, and an understanding of who we are in the context of U.S. society, or in the context of in context of who we are as a Latinx community. And so I think that this is vital. I think about it, the urgency now that I have a nephew, and I think about my role in supporting him develop a critical consciousness around these topics. I also think that in this time, you know, it's been really interesting to think about the current crisis that we're in, to kind of Marco's point, and to think about, you know, what's going to happen in the aftermath, because in many ways, children are now home, right? For better or worse, we can say children are home with their families. For a lot of my Indigenous colleagues, you know, they oftentimes talk about, you know, that part of what they vision for Indigenous education is the removal of age segregation. That young children are being taught by their families, by their communities, by elders, and we kind of have that now, right? I also think that we're in a crisis as we start to prepare for what's going to happen in the aftermath, and that I think there's going to be a further entrenchment of certain kinds of practices as we gear up to return to quote unquote back to normal, right? And so I worry about the consequences when we have, you know, a whitewashing of history in a moment where things will be reordered back into how things were, if not with more force. So I am concerned about that as an educator, and thinking through what that means, and the imperative that we have to tell our young children the truth, to know the truth ourselves. I will also say that, you know, if people are really looking to think about what they can do now, like to give concrete support, I think that, you know, we need folks, you know, across the board supporting campaigns for ethnic studies. We need folks supporting organizations like Community to Community and our farm worker-led struggles. We need campaigns that support our young people and their access to these histories and these knowledges. So as we consider, you know, how can we celebrate, I want to kind of maybe expand what celebration looks like, right? And what role can people play who are not Latinx, or who are from different coalitions, different racial ethnic groups? How can they contribute to this work? And that, I think, you know, if we were to support campaigns for ethnic studies, if we were to support sit-ins around like what you're doing right now, Janice, in organizing this event, then we help to mitigate some of this whitewashing that you've shared, and begin to kind of provide folks a space to really build a critical analysis of what is Cinco de Mayo, and hopefully that becomes a platform for really recovering other histories that have been distorted by these these master narratives.
Thank you so much. Those are really powerful words, and I appreciate just even that was, for me, that was a call to action, and I hope many of you took it the same way. I'd like to know if anyone else has questions out there for Irene, Vero, and Marco. And if you're raising your hand, I can't see you, so you're gonna have to shout out if you have a burning question. In the meantime, another thing that I think the pandemic has really brought out for me is how equity, diversity, inclusion programs, they were really at the top, at the forefront of our minds for a long time. And I feel like as soon as the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, all of these really important topics just got shifted in a way that really negatively impacts the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs were supporting students and our communities. What have you seen as far as how institutions of education or anywhere else have really been impacted by the pandemic with regard to equity programs?
Wow. Well, I can say it's interesting. Well, I'll just speak that I have my partners at home right now. We're both trying to not be in each other's space. That's another conversation of trying to figure out. But he works for the Attorney General's office, and right now I think one of the big crises that are impacting that I'm experiencing on the daily through him are the kind of the increase in evictions, right? And how that disproportionately also impacts folks of color, folks that don't have access to particular kinds of resources or rent support, or, so I think that, as I'm experiencing in real time, I could speak in terms of our students at Western, which I know, Janice, you probably have a similar situation of food insecurities, houselessness, and the challenges that come with that. And I think, if anything, one of the things that I've also come to realize is that the frameworks that, the ethnic studies, or that frameworks that are, that help us to understand our own lives become more vital right now. Because I think, in these moments where we're trying to make sense on the day-to-day, we also need to feel like we're whole people in this, right? And that we're engaged in this moment as a collective, as a community. And so I know that these frameworks give folks some pause to think about, like, we're not alone. And whether it's our ancestors and future communities, this has been a long history of us continuing in this struggle. And so I also think that is an important part of this too. So I know that I can speak for the student struggles, but also, like, on the statewide, seeing these things disproportionately impact folks of color across the state is definitely something that's kept our house up late at night, trying to think through, like, how can we really support in this moment? So I'll stop there.
Marco, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of as Vera was talking about that. I was kind of also thinking about a comment that I was reading earlier, because I was trying to read people's comments as they were typing. But I think I'm reading another one now. let me read another one. Hold on. Okay, yeah. So I'm reading the last comment. I think it's. Let me see let me read it out loud to folks. We have a question. It says, Marco, you mentioned a law that was passed that allowed for folks who were indigenous or of Spanish descent. When was that passed? I think it was 1850 when that was passed. And so to answer that question, it was called the Greaser Act. And basically what that was that it was a law that punished folks who were considered of quote unquote Indian and Spanish descent, who were armed, right? And so to try to understand this is during the California Gold Rush. So everybody was armed, right? So everybody's like living out basically in the woods, right? And so it was up to the individual law enforcement officer to decide if the person that was of indigenous and Spanish heritage, if they were of good character, right? So it gave them the basically the say if this person that they came across that was of indigenous and Spanish heritage and good character, and if they weren't of good character, then that law enforcement officer had the ability to arrest them, right? And so that's when that was passed, was 1850. And so I think, and I'm glad you kind of asked that question, because one of the things that was as interesting about these laws during this time period is that in the U.S., this topic of miscegenation, of race mixing, has always been very taboo, right? And I think in Latin America it hasn't been as taboo as it has been in the United States, right? At least openly, right? Because we know that miscegenation took place, in covert forms, if we want to say it that way, right? But one of the things that that really scared the different legislatures of the time, whether it be in California or across the country, were that they were incorporating these people that they called of the mongrel races, right? Of the mongrel races, which basically were race mixed people that they didn't want incorporating into the United States, right? Because they wanted the United States to be a white country. And so during the same time period, you also realize that some of the reasons that they, especially in the 1890s, and this was true for both Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, was that the reason that they didn't want to incorporate those parts of the world into the United States was because they didn't want to bring those people into the Union, right? Because in their mind, they had a lot of mixed race people in those parts of the world. Right. And so I think, and I wanted to kind of make that connection, because I think it's important to understand that sort of connection of what mixed race people are kind of perceived to be in the public imaginary in the United States, right? And how we're perceived to be sort of dangerous, right? I also wanted to, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, in the book that Irene and Vero were talking about earlier, by Hayes, Batista Hayes, and it's a really good book, so I highly recommend it. And they kind of alluded to it earlier, but he talks about how up until when California was a part of Mexico, people that were indigenous held high positions in government, and many were very wealthy, right? And so when the U.S. kind of takes California as a state, these people that were, quote unquote, full-blooded indigenous. I say full-blooded indigenous because I'm one of those people that doesn't believe in blood quantum, right? But those folks had really high positions in government, and also had really high positions in society. When the U.S. takes over, they're no longer allowed to participate in things as juries and courts, right? So, given this context of the Dred Scott decision of I think it was let me look through my notes actually, 1857. So a lot of those folks also thought that once if I think we talked about this kind of briefly in the beginning, was that if the U.S. lost the war to the Confederacy, a lot of those people, given the Dred Scott decision, will also lose a lot of the rights that they had prior to California joining the Union. Right, so they were also deeply invested in making sure that the Union beat the Confederacy, because they were already realizing that their lives were changing drastically from being able to participate in civic life, and now and how that was quickly changing under the auspices of the United States, right? So, but that's kind of going back to wanted to point that out. But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Marco. I want to say that we have about 3 minutes left, but we just had a couple of great questions pop up. So I'm not sure if
I just saw them.
Okay.
Can I add just real quick? Because I won't go into all the things that they were discussing before, but kind of on that diversity equity piece. But how do you teach this? And I saw someone mention right now in the chat how they're in hostile spaces, and just because my district's 92% or we're majority, I feel like I'm walking into the 1950s, and when they used to basically hit Mexican students in schools, in some ways, because the pushback is real. The pushback to teaching this, it had happened to me every single day I walked in and out of those 3 high schools. Now that I'm here, obviously I'm not dealing with that in a physical way, but I still go to staff meetings online, right? So you could still hear the resistance, right, to what I'm teaching all the time. How they don't want to, let us have that. How they would say things about classes like, oh, it's not academic enough. My class is a G requirement for the UC system, right? So yeah, and we read Occupied America, which is a college text that I used to teach at the University of Washington. So my students are fully capable. Then there's people saying it's not academic enough. You have people just constantly attacking the fact that we have this class. How do you make Indigenous students feel proud? I mean, you have to infuse that into everything you do too, whether it's Chicanx studies, Latinx studies. My class is officially called Latinx studies. Whether it's a general ethics studies, like a survey course, you have to infuse it, because what Vero said earlier about the land is so important. We have to know what's here, what history is hidden, and what do we need to uncover still. And maybe that's not directly tied to a student who maybe had came here from some other place, but you know what? Them learning that helps them uncover who they are too, because they're going to be more curious about, well, where am I from? And maybe I should talk to my family members, or if my family don't want to talk to me, maybe I'm just going to research it on my own, right? Because some of that stuff can be painful and sensitive issues for people to discuss, but we have to have entry points somehow. But I can't tell you that it's not a struggle. It took 46 years for my class to be put into Azusa schools after they did their own walkouts in 1968 in December. So, you know, the struggle continues. And I think, you know, we just need to keep pushing to make sure we tell our truth and celebrate ourselves and make our young people feel proud to be who they are. They should never have to bow their head to anybody.
Go ahead, Beto.
Now, the last thing I'll just say, first of all, to Irene and Marco, thank you both. Like, yeah, I want to continue this conversation for a minute, because it's just being in such great company. I would just say that the one thing I'll add for those of you that are speaking to how can we as educators do this work and the hostility, the reality is that our school districts and our educational reality is a hostile one to this work. To kind of speak truth, you are working against the grain. And so my thing is, we can't shy away from that reality. We can't paint something different to educators that are coming through. But what we can do, and I think is really important, is that we have to build collectives around this work. We cannot do it alone. And I stress that very, very strongly with our students at Western. To assume that you can be the one to usher in, you alone are the one to usher in some of this, is to assume falsely, because it's not a question of if they're going to come for you, it's a question of when. And so to do this work, you need to build collectives. And so I say that without giving a prescriptive or prescribing how to do that, because I think that each local space needs to think through some of the politics of its community building. But to assume that you can do this alone is to put yourself up to engage in a battle that, and we've been seeing this, right? Folks of color who do justice work, particularly women and queers of color, are dying at a much younger rate from all kinds of, I would call racial battle fatigue consequences, right? So I think that we need to build collectives around this. And for our white educators, like, it's complicated, but you got to continue to lean into those complexities. I think it's a privilege when folks can just walk away from it and assume it because it doesn't pertain to me or it doesn't affect our communities, we shouldn't be involved. I think you need to lead into it. And I think that it's complicated, right? And I think we just need to acknowledge it. For white folks doing this work, it is complicated, but it means that we have to wrestle through those contradictions and those complexities so that we can continue to provide an education we all deserve. So thank you for
that. Thank you so much, Vero. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Irene. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and just also offer that this is my son. He went through 5 years of Spanish courses in his elementary school, and it took one time for us to just bring up what the true history of Cinco de Mayo is for him to then bring it up every year following that. So it doesn't mean that he knows the entire history. It doesn't mean that he's done his own research. It's just a conversation starter, and one that I think will stay with him, hopefully, as he moves forward. So now in middle school, he's able to at least question what he's being taught in classes, whether he does it directly with his instructors or he does it at home with us. And so in talking to children, really just asking them questions and asking them to ask questions, I think is a great start. I welcome you all to join us for any Fireside Chat. We update our website regularly. So if you found us via Facebook or Instagram or on our webpage, know that we will offer more Fireside Chats very soon in the future. I think this has been, like, the amount of wisdom that was brought into this conversation today is immeasurable. And I really appreciate your time and your willingness. And Irene, thank you for stepping in. Like, you were contacted, 40 minutes before the panel started, and we are so lucky to have had all of your words in this space with us today. So thank you all. Join us again in the Intercultural Center. And I think that's it. Anybody else have anything to add? You're welcome to unmute and thank our panelists and give them any shout outs or wave or blow kisses, however you'd like to do it. I just really appreciate all of your presences today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day at home.
I see you, Justina.
As you isolate in your
Thank
spaces.
you, everyone.
Hey, Vero. Good to see you.
Thanks, Vero. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, Vero. Thank you,
So
Mako.
good.
Very helpful. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Peace out, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
What'd you say? Irene, would you, maybe I can get your contact information from Marco so that I can send you some.
Yeah, he has it. He has everything. He should have my cell too. So
Okay.
yeah, feel free to ask him. He'll do it. All right. Thank you so much.
Hey,
Nice to meet
Tucker.
you.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you.